Hi class, welcome to our third video in our module on adolescence. In this video, you're going to be learning about psychosocial development during this period of the lifespan development. Let's take a moment to reflect. What do you think are the most common problems and issues faced by teens today? This may be something that you've recently experienced. Maybe you are currently in this stage of development, or maybe it was pretty recent for you, or maybe it was many years ago. What did you experience, or what are you experiencing? What do you think are the most common issues? I think one significant issue is issues with body image. So during the transition from childhood to adulthood, while their bodies are morphing into new shapes and sizes, teens are struggling to come to terms with their bodies and to get comfortable inside their own skins. Now, with this can potentially come eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. And these typically start just before and during adolescence. And eating disorders can have a significant effect on a teen's health. And this includes both their physical and their mental health. And it can also have an effect on their relationships and day-to-day functioning. While eating disorders affect more women than they do men, many young men are developing issues with their muscles where they become very obsessed with being bigger and more muscular. And you might find this being called online muscle dysmorphia. And while this is not officially recognized as a disorder, it could be related to what's called body dysmorphic disorder. And even if the discontentment that a teen has with their body doesn't cause them to excessively exercise or perhaps develop some additional symptoms of an eating disorder, the ongoing and pervasive feeling that their bodies are not right can have many lasting negative effects on their lives. What about another issue being maybe unmet need for community or identity? So let's first think about identity. One of the most important tasks of the life of a teen is to figure out who they are. We're going to be looking at Erikson's fifth stage of psychosocial development that he called identity achievement versus role confusion. And as we look at that stage, I'd encourage you to think about your own identity development. So what about community? Well, when teens get the message that they don't fit in and don't belong, it can lead to feelings of isolation. It can cause feelings of being disconnected and can lead to depression. Think about some of the television programs that are marketed at this age that some of them actually normalize bullying. They normalize premarital sex and they normalize aggression and sometimes violent behavior. In other words, it's like you're only cool if you own all, if you're actually doing some of these things, or, maybe if you are, being aggressive towards others, or if you're breaking rules. So there can be this sense that this is what you ought to be doing. Or maybe you're only cool if you have all the brands. And so it makes sense then that teens may be, feel overwhelmed with these messages. They may be defiant or maybe even out of control with their behavior. I think a big one today is probably time management. I wonder if you think this. I wish we could be in class together. I'm curious about what you all think about this, but I think about the number of projects and assignments and all of the demands that students have when they're in high school. I think about things like social drama, extracurricular activities, being distracted by social media, and having to juggle all of these expectations and how this can cause a lot of stress. And so the adolescent is really, in many instances, expected to act like an adult. They're expected to manage their work independently, to follow through on the right decisions, to make the right decisions, to manage money oftentimes. And you'll often hear parents who complain about things like, their teen's bedroom not being clean, or things, perhaps the teen has lost things, or smelly socks or whatever there may be. But really, let's ask, where is the time? There are so many demands that teens are facing today. It's so difficult to do it all, and the pressure then can make teens more prone to anxiety and depression. So speaking of parents, what about parental pressure or social pressure? Maybe some of you have experienced that. So I think about parents, many of them will live through their children. They might expect their kids to achieve everything that they wanted, but didn't have or couldn't do or didn't do. They're expecting their teenager to get good grades, to have good friends, and to excel in extracurricular activities, to be well behaved, to be responsible. And sometimes this might include responsibility for younger siblings, and this is a lot of pressure. And then added to this can be peer pressure. So a lot of pressure. And then I think it's important for us to also think about mental and physical health issues. So let's think about just overall physical health. For example, nutrition. We know that teens are not prone to have the best eating habits. Now, that doesn't mean all teens, of course, but if we look on average, we would probably find that there are less than healthy behaviors or less healthy behaviors among teens than there are people who are in young adulthood. And this is for many different reasons. And this, of course, can have an effect on mental health. We know that if you're not eating a balanced diet, this can have an effect on how a person feels and their energy level. And then we also can think about some of the issues with eating disorders that can develop because after having binged on unhealthy, very high calorie, fatty foods, we have this cultural pressure then to maintain a particular body size and shape. And so there's this pressure, yet there's this sort of norm, or at least this, this pretty typical behavior of not eating the most healthy foods. And again, that's not to say all teens, but there is less than healthy eating behavior on average among teens. And so this with the cultural pressures sort of sets that potential stage for eating disorders. There are many other factors, of course, that contribute to the development of eating disorders, and those are separate issues. And of course, there can be family issues going on at the time that can contribute to that as well. So in addition, I think it's when we think about health, teens many of them are not getting adequate sleep. We know that sleep can have an effect on overall health and well-being. And so in an effort to do it all and to be it all, the teen may not be getting the sleep that they need. And they need about 9 hours of sleep, but on average, they get about 7 hours. And so this means that every day they're running on a sleep deficit. And then let's think about, depression and anxiety, how this then can we see some increasing rates when we look at that movement from childhood into adolescence. So when we think about mental health, this, of course, can come along with some of the physical changes. We can think about things like hormonal changes, the added chaos and strain of scheduling, prioritizing, achieving, fulfilling expectations. And this presents a lot of emotional pressure. And this can then increase a teen's risk for developing depression and anxiety. Some additional ones that some of you may have thought of may be having a lack of positive role models. Some of you may have some very positive role models, but not all teens do. And this is where certain programs can be very helpful, community programs. Some of you may think of some that you're aware of that help to provide positive role models for teens, because we know how important that can be in development. Another issue, probably one that came to mind for many of you, is drugs and alcohol use. If we look at some of the data, just in 2017, for example, 5.9% of teenagers in the US reported using marijuana daily, and 40% in this same year of 12th graders had used some kind of illicit drug in the past year. Probably some additional things you may have thought of would be bullying and maybe risky sexual behavior, which can lead to teen pregnancy. So a lot of issues being faced during this time. And I'd encourage you, as you think about adolescent psychosocial development, to think about the interaction between the physical changes, the psychosocial changes, and cognitive development that's happening during this time. So, what will you be learning about the psychosocial changes that happen during this time? You're going to be learning about the changes in self concept and self esteem. You're also going to be learning about Erickson's fifth psychosocial task of identity versus role confusion. And you'll learn about Marcia's four identity statuses that relate directly to Erickson's stage of identity versus role confusion. You'll also learn about the three stages of ethnic identity development and the parent-teen relationship. And then you're also going to be learning about the role of peers. So let's get started. During the stage of adolescence, self-concept continues to develop and incorporates abstract reasoning and an ability to consider the future. And self-understanding is often full of contradictions. In addition, self-esteem now includes perceptions of competency in romantic and career areas. Throughout this semester, we've been exploring a very prominent personality development theorist named Erik Erikson. And Erikson, as you'll remember, suggested that we go through a series of 8 stages of what he called psychosocial development. During adolescence, we go into the 5th stage of psychosocial development that he called identity versus role confusion. Erikson suggested that adolescents face a crisis then between identity and role confusion. And the crisis involves balancing the desire to try out many possible selves and then the need to select a single self. So adolescents, Erikson thought, who achieve a sense of identity, they're well prepared to face the next developmental challenge, which is establishing intimate, sharing relationships with others. We'll be exploring that stage when we get into the next chapter. So how do adolescents establish an identity? Think about yourselves when you were in adolescence, and some of you may still be in a place where you're trying to figure out who you are and what you believe in and what's important to you. And so you may be in this stage still. This stage doesn't only, it's not only limited to the middle teen years. It also can happen during the late teens and into the 20s. Each individual is unique in their experience during this stage. So the way that individuals establish an identity, according to Erikson, is through the use of hypothetical reasoning skills that we can think of as being associated with the formal operational stage. And so what they're doing is they're experimenting with different selves to learn about different possible identities. And so they have the cognitive skills to enable them to imagine themselves in different roles. And so some of this testing is career oriented. For example, someone may think of themselves as, being in a band and being a drummer, or maybe being a professional athlete, or being in the Peace Corps, or writing a novel. And then other testing may be romantically oriented, where teens might fall in love and then imagine living with the one that they love. And then there's some of the exploration, it also involves religious and political beliefs. So teens give different identities a trial run, and just like you might test drive a different car before buying one. And then as they give these identities trial runs, adolescents begin to discover who they will be. So as adolescents strive to achieve an identity, they're really progressing through different phases or statuses. And we're going to be looking at these in a little bit more detail here in just a moment. And these were statuses that were proposed by someone named Marcia. That was her last name, Marcia. And overall, what we see during this stage, though, is that there is this, what we call a moratorium, where there is a delay in commitment to an identity while exploring options. And as I pointed out, most identity formation, it may occur in the teen years, but it may not occur until early adulthood. So some of you may still be in this stage. So Marcia suggested that there are 4 different identity statuses. And you can, if you look at, on table 6.2, there is a depiction of the characteristics of each of these identity statuses. So what we could really boil this down to is what we call commitment to an identity and exploration. So let's explore each of these different identity statuses. Let's start with the first one, which is identity diffusion. And it's the first one just because of its location on this table. And so with identity diffusion, you have no exploration. So exploration is absent. And you also have an absence of commitment to an identity. So in this state, the individual's overwhelmed by the task of achieving an identity, and they do little to accomplish this. So an example might be Larry hates the idea of deciding what to do with his future, so he spends most of his free time playing video games. I am certainly not knocking playing video games when I say this, but what I am saying is that if you're spending so much time doing something that is taking your attention away from figuring out what you want and what you believe, then that may be an indicator of diffusion. Certainly people can play video games and still achieve an identity. All right, so let's take a look at the next one down, which is identity foreclosure. So here we have no exploration, but we do have a commitment to an identity. And so the individual here has a status that's determined by adults rather than by personal exploration. So for example, as long as she can remember, Elizabeth's parents have told her that she should be an attorney and join the family law firm. So she plans to study pre-law in college, even though she's never given the matter much thought. So if she had given the matter much thought and still wanted to do that, then we would not be in a state of foreclosure. We would actually be in a state of achievement. But because she hasn't given this much thought and she is committing, this is called foreclosure. We then have what's called moratorium, and this is where we have commitment as absent and exploration is present. So the individual here is examining different alternatives, but has yet to find one that's satisfactory. So for example, Brad enjoys most of his high school classes. Some days he thinks it would be fun to be a chemist, some days he wants to be a novelist, and some days he'd like to be an elementary school teacher. He thinks it's a little weird to change his mind so often, but he also enjoys thinking about different jobs. Then finally, we have what's called identity achievement, which is the goal. And this is where we have the presence of exploration and we have commitment. So the individual has explored alternatives and has chosen a specific identity and done so deliberately. So for example, we may have throughout middle school, James wanted to play in the WNBA, and during 9th and 10th grades, and let's say Jamie, so Jamie wanted to play in the WNBA, and during 9th and 10th grades, she thought it would be cool to be a physician. And in 11th grade, she took a computing course and everything finally clicked and she'd found her niche. She knew she wanted to study computer science in college. So she has actively explored herself. Now, I think it would be interesting for us to once again think about the cross-cultural variables that may affect identity, achievement, and exploration. So if we were in a collectivistic culture, we may see less individual exploration. Because remember, in a collectivistic culture, we have more of an emphasis on group goals and how our decisions affect our family and community. Whereas in an individualistic culture, we have more of an emphasis on our individual needs, our individual goals and pursuits and competition. So we might see more of an emphasis then on our own individual exploration. Some important components to identity formation or facets of identity formation include religious identity, political identity, vocational identity, and gender identity. And when we think about gender identity, we need to think about the sexual changes of puberty and how these issues of gender identity and sexual identity, which are two separate things, become especially relevant. And these two forms of identity do somewhat overlap. So what do we mean by gender identity? Well, this refers to what it means to be male or female, and this is linked to sexual expression, but it also concerns broader issues of masculinity and femininity. And this gender role socialization becomes very intense during adolescence. Now, Also, sexual identity, that's a matter of forming an enduring recognition of the meaning of one's sexual feelings, their attractions, and their behaviors. And this often takes the form of labeling one's sexual orientation. And this is an aspect of identity that's especially salient for many of today's teens. But for those of you who are not members of sexual minorities, you may not really recognize that sexual identity development is an important part of identity formation, because for you it may have been a largely unconscious process, especially because you haven't had to experience in this specific regard the pressures that adolescents experience who may not be in the majority, and so their process is much more conscious. And so overall, when we think of the issues of sexual identity and gender identity, this intensifies as children make the transition into adolescence. And I want to point out that even though sexual identity exploration is critical during adolescence, it can also occur or reoccur in adulthood, especially if it was not adequately explored during adolescence. A central part of identity development, especially for those who are not in the majority, is ethnic identity, although this can be a process that everyone experiences. The process of ethnic identity development, it's in some respects, it follows the same process as identity development in general, where there's this an unquestioning view of oneself is altered during a period of crisis. And many parents will clearly attempt to teach their children about their ethnic identity, both explicitly by telling them about it and more subtly by exposing them to various experiences. There's some important phrases or terms that you may have heard of before that are related to integration of ethnicity into the larger sense of oneself. One is called assimilation, and this is where an individual tries to adopt the majority culture's norms and standards, but they do this at the expense of their own group. And then another is marginalization, and this means living within the majority culture but feeling estranged. And then another is separation, and this refers to associating primarily with members of one's own culture and then rejecting the majority culture. And then there's something known as biculturalism, and this means maintaining ties both to the majority culture and to one's own ethnic culture. And many researchers actually believe that biculturalism is especially adaptive in terms of, where an individual is retaining the norms of both the majority and the minority cultures and then selecting between them depending upon the circumstances. Overall, this process is requiring consideration of both positive and negative beliefs. And then the resolution may depend on the status and the dominant culture. And high status groups, like those who are in the majority, do tend to explore less. Finney suggested that there are three different aspects or experiences of identity formation related to ethnicity. And one is the unexamined ethnic identity, and this is where there's little consideration of issues. And so here we would have a lack of exposure to ethnic identity issues and little thought to the question of ethnic heritage. This is similar to diffusion. If we go back to Erickson's stage of identity versus role confusion, and then Marcia's outcome of diffusion. And then we have adopting families' ethnicity with little thought. And this is similar to foreclosure, which is one of those outcomes according to Marcia. And then we also have another possibility, possibility, which is ethnic identity search. And this is where we have an exploration of the customs, the culture, and the history of one's group. And this is often caused by an event that awakens a person to their ethnic group. And then there's an immersion in the ethnic. And then we have an achieved ethnic identity, where we have an appreciation or understanding of ethnic heritage. And this usually follows exploration, and it may be unrelated to involvement in customs and values of their ethnic culture. Sometimes what's seen is a moving back and forth between moratorium and achievement. And if you'll recall,
A moratorium is where there is active exploration. So an individual may be actively exploring and then have achievement, and then with new information or new opportunities may move back into moratorium and then move into achievement again. As I mentioned a few moments ago, bicultural identity seems to be the most positive outcome. And this is where an individual views themselves as part of both the ethnic minority group and the larger society. Many different factors have been found to influence the racial identity development of individuals with multiracial heritage. And this includes phenotype, a surname, geographical location, community demographics, generational status, and then family and peer supports. It seems that family has probably the largest fundamental impact on the individual and their identity. And it's viewed as the primary institution that's responsible for answering questions about racial identity. And strong supportive relationships between caregivers and multiracial children can foster a healthy identity developmental process. And some caregivers take it upon themselves to help their child self-identify with a racial category. And caregivers may label their children's identity to protect them from confusion, from or from perhaps racial discrimination. Sometimes caregivers may avoid the topic of race if, and then some families may not begin to discuss being a multiracial family or the possible challenges that multiracial youth may face. But in this case, the multiracial child often seeks a role model, and if they can't find one, then they may feel misunderstood. And this is often, more often the case in a biracial household where each caregiver may have their own individual race that they identify. And so, in this instance, the youth may feel that caregivers don't understand what it's like to be biracial. And also, I think it's important to note too that communities have a very big impact on racial identity, and many aspects of the community have been found to be related to this development, like how diverse is the community, and how and what is that experience like for that individual in the community. And people who are raised in diverse communities tend to report fewer negative experience and feel more acceptance of their multiracial identity. Whereas people who are in less diverse locations, they're more often reporting experiencing more discrimination, questioning, or challenges that are related to their racial identity. I think if you were to watch television programs and movies, you often see that there is an underlying story where at least part of the story is that teens are not getting along with their parents. But in actuality, most teens and parents do get along. Now, there can be some possible conflicts about autonomy. So, they may have more conflicts with their mothers, and parents do tend to control daughters more, and there are cultural factors that may be affecting this. I also want to mention, if you go back earlier in the semester where we learned about attachment, and you learned about the different attachment styles, overall different types of insecure attachment versus secure attachment. Of course, as we discussed earlier, secure attachment has many more positive outcomes, and this is true as well in adolescence. Children who have secure attachment with their parents have better emotional well-being and peer relationships and less drug use and criminal behavior. Peer relationships are very influential in adolescence, and during this time when young people are developing autonomy from their parents, peers then become a significant source of social and emotional support. And the attitudes of adolescent friends can have both positive and negative influences. Strong peer attachments can enhance a young person's well-being, while problems in peer relationships like bullying can have a significant psychological, physical, academic, and social emotional consequences, both for the victim and even for the perpetrator. So given the significance of peer relationships in adolescence, it's important for us to understand the nature of these relationships. So let's first think about how important acceptance is oftentimes for adolescents. And so Adolescents may feel that they need to modify their speech, their dress, their behavior, maybe their choices or activities to become more similar to their peers. And this increased similarity among their peers provides them with a sense of security and can affirm their acceptance into that peer group. Now, if you'll remember when we talked about Erikson said that adolescents are in the stage of identity versus role confusion. So these peer relationships can provide an opportunity for a moratorium, in other words, for identity exploration, but they can also provide the sort of breeding ground for foreclosure, where an adolescent does not explore who they are, and because they have a significant need to be accepted, may instead of actively exploring, commit to what they think others want them to be, or just commit because of what they think is most acceptable or the most popular way of being. While many of us might characterize adolescent romantic relationships as oftentimes short-lived or perhaps superficial, and certainly this is not the case of all adolescent relationships, but many, as many may only last a few weeks or months, and oftentimes these relationships may not have the level of depth and complexity that characterizes long-term committed relationships. This, characterization of these relationships as perhaps maybe not as intense or as rather superficial may not be complete, because these relationships are central to adolescents' lives, and they're a major topic of conversation among adolescents, and they are really the most common cause of strong positive and strong negative emotions, even more so than friendships, and often with even relationships with parents. And adolescents really aren't the only ones who see these as being significant. It's even thought of by researchers as an important developmental task of adolescence, and that they have significant implications for health and for adjustment. As we move from middle adolescence into late adolescence, where we are really on the border of early adulthood, late adolescents are moving into much more intense, exclusive relationships. And of course, there's always variations throughout adolescence. And what we're doing here as we talk about these themes and concepts is we're talking about what is generally seen. There are always exceptions. I want to point out that as we begin to look at, as we begin to go into the next chapter, in what we're going to see is we're going to see Erikson's stage of intimacy versus isolation. And this is where the goal of psychosocial development, or the task, is to form a close, intimate relationship with a partner. And I want you to start to think about how our progression through earlier stages will or can affect our success in that stage. So think about Erikson's first stage of trust versus mistrust. How might that affect your success in relationships? Or how might it affect how you approach relationships? And what can we do to overcome feelings of mistrust that we may have developed early on? Think about other stages like industry versus inferiority, or the most recent one that we've looked at in this chapter of identity versus role confusion. How important is it to have established an identity, to know who you are, to know what your beliefs are and your values are when you want to select a mate? Are you going to be more committed to a mate if you know who you are? Are you more likely to select a potential partner that you are going to be successful with if you know who you are? Is that important? Is it not important? So we're going to be exploring that, and you're going to see how Erikson's stages build on one another. Please let me know what questions you have after listening to this and after reading your chapter. And I look forward to our next review, and thank you all so much.
So what did you learn about the psychosocial changes in adolescence? You learned about the changes in self-concept and self-esteem in this stage of development. You also learned about Erikson's stage of identity versus role confusion. And you learned about Marcia's four identity statuses. And I'd encourage you to think about where you are in your identity development. And keep in mind that while many people achieve identity during adolescence, not all people do. It's sometimes not until early and even middle adulthood when people do. So think about too how the earlier stages that we go through affect our ability to achieve identity. For example, how does the ability to have a sense of trust in others affect identity development? You may think, well, I'm not sure how that would affect my identity development. I don't remember how I experienced trust or mistrust when I was a baby. But actually, you may not remember, but your brain was shaped by that experience. And you developed a perspective about whether or how much you could trust the world around you. And when we think about identity development, we do have to have some trust in other people, in the feedback that they give us. We also know that later stages like autonomy versus shame and doubt, for example, industry versus inferiority, those and their success, the successful movement through those stages are affected by earlier stages. And then identity achievement is affected by those stages that were affected by the earlier ones. So each of these earlier stages that we've gone through have an effect on what we currently experience. And as we think about adolescence, think about how your own progression through the earlier stages of development have affected you, and how did they affect how you saw yourself and your movement through this stage of identity exploration. You also learned about the 3 stages of ethnic identity development, and you learned about the parent-teen relationship. And then you learned about the role of peers. As always, I would encourage you, if you have any questions as you're reading your book or after watching these videos, or if you have any questions in general at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I look forward to seeing each of you online.